Okay, everyone, I wanted to make this video to talk about the kinds of questions that we ask and what kinds of questions we can then answer. And broadly speaking, I think there's two kinds of questions that are out there that oftentimes get conflated with each other or intermingled in a way that we have trouble understanding even our disagreements with each other because we don't understand the basic distinction between these questions. And so I want to talk about those questions. I think this is going to be very helpful for you guys when you're talking to each other and finding disagreements with each other, finding that you don't agree with an argument that someone is making, to understand exactly what kind of question they're asking so you can understand where the disagreement actually lies. Okay. So we can think really broadly about two kinds of questions that are out there. And I want us to really work on making this distinction between empirical questions and normative questions. Empirical questions are really questions about what exists in the world out there, right? What's actually going on in the world. This is a question about what is, right? It's a question that's centered around what kinds of patterns are out in the world, what sorts of, you might say, so think about what kinds of inequalities are out there in the world, what sorts of social facts, what social phenomena are out there that we're dealing with. Those are empirical questions about the world. Normative questions are questions about what should exist, how should people behave, what should we care about, what kinds of policies should we put into place, right? Those are all normative questions. They're centered around moral and political problems in the world and how we want to address things in a moral or political sense. Now, it's really important to distinguish these questions because empirical questions are questions about social facts, right? They're questions about what does this thing look like in the current state, right? A question, for example, about income inequality is what kinds of inequalities are out there? How big is the difference between, let's say, the top 1% and the rest of the bottom 99%? Or what's the difference between the very top of the income distribution, the top 10% of the income distribution, and the bottom 10% of the income distribution? That's fundamentally a question about what exists in the world, what empirical patterns are out there in the world. Normative questions center then on what should exist. The question of, should we do anything about inequality? Is income inequality a moral problem? Is it something that we should try to address with our social policies? And it's really important to make that distinction because oftentimes when we disagree or we're debating one another about a particular issue, we don't even realize where we disagree. Are we disagreeing about what exists in the world, about what those inequalities look like? Are we disagreeing about how we should handle those or whether or not this is a moral problem? Now, sociological questions are typically empirical questions. This means we need to have social scientific evidence, and we've talked a lot about the different kinds of methods to collect data and how we can analyze those data. But this doesn't mean that normative questions are not important. They're very often the thing that motivates us to ask those empirical questions in the first place. So normative questions are almost always in the background, right? If we're asking the question of what kinds of inequalities exist, this is very often because we care about those inequalities and see it as problematic. If we ask a question about whether or not poverty leads in childhood leads one to be more likely to live in poverty as an adult, it's because we care about poverty. We see that as potentially a moral or political problem that we need to address. That is, we see that as normatively problematic. So it's not the case that we should privilege one or the other of these kind of questions, but we do want to separate them when we're having conversations so we can understand if we're disagreeing because we don't see the data the same way, because we have different forms of evidence that we're looking at, or are we disagreeing because we have a different moral understanding of the problem or see it in a different normative light? All right, so this should give us a handle on thinking about these two different kinds of questions, and let's keep these in mind as we go forward in our conversations with one another. And try to ask yourself: am I disagreeing with someone because I disagree with the facts that they're presenting, or am I disagreeing with them because I disagree with the normative impetus behind their question? All right, guys, we'll talk soon then.